questions of both clarifying and non-clarifying nature.
So this is something that I have a very tenuous grasp on. I could be getting all the details wrong entirely, but my memory is that Clifford Geertz had this argument about agricultural involution, particularly in the Indonesian archipelago, and the argument was that as available land gets used up, basically, intensification occurs. You have more and more reliance on labor rather than on the natural fertility of the land, right? And that then favors a shift to large family size because children's labor in, say, wet rice agriculture becomes valuable because you have, maintaining irrigation systems and terraces, and it's just lots and lots of little chores for little hands, right? It seems to me, and I can't remember whether Geertz addressed this or not, but then if you extend that logically, that argument to its conclusion, that favors a polygynous system because a single landowner can have many more helping hands if he has multiple wives than if he has a single one. But pitted against the problem of the division of land, that argues against it. And so it would seem to me that you should see a tension there, oscillation perhaps as a function of total landholding size or something like that between polygyny and monogamy.
Yeah, that is interesting. I'm not familiar with that particular part of the world, partly because the anthropologists that have looked into these issues were working specifically in Sub-Saharan Africa and comparing this to the European case, but I'll certainly look into that. It sounds very interesting. So there certainly is a balance between, again, dividing resources, as you say, and how much labor you have. The sort of producing children to produce labor is something that comes up also in the African literature, certainly. So it does. I guess the sort of most fruitful way of thinking about this is to think in terms of, are there particular things in the inheritance system, for example, that would make polygyny special in a sense? I think this provides a sort of a baseline to ask these kinds of questions.
Right.
So I'm not sure what inheritance would be like in this particular society.
So I guess where I was going with that was the following. So the strategic optimum is different for a wealthy man in such a system than for an average man, because the wealthy man wants a polygynous system. He can afford to divide up his landholding among multiple offspring, and in fact, he gets increasing returns from polygyny by virtue of the value of labor, whereas the average man wants a monogamous system. And in general, if wealth correlates with power and prestige, then that correlates with the arbiter of the norm, right? So you would see, this tension as to what the right thing to do with the system.
Yeah, for sure. Wealth inequality among males is not something that we have in the model, but it certainly seems to play, you'd expect it to play a big role, yeah.
So it seems like this shift to, so you had the sort of, the primogeniture graphs in the beginning where if you have polygyny with primogeniture, then you're necessarily splitting it between the first sons of each of your wives, right? But there's an alternative where you have unigeniture and just have the son of the first wife inherit or something, right? And it seems like that has implications in thinking about the role of female choice in polygyny, because if only the first wife's son inherits, right, that's a huge disincentive to the other wives. So it seems like you can speak with a sort of different kind of data set that has been used to actually think about the role of female choice in polygyny.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that is, I guess I didn't quite say here, but intuitively, that goes precisely to the heart of the matter, right? If you know that there is a norm and that your husband will transfer all of his resources to the first wife's offspring, then you have no incentive to marry him as your second wife, and just go off and find somebody else.
It'd be interesting to look at sort of situations where there's considerable coercion and then see what that system looks like, right? Because it's the advantage of the man to have polygynous wives and have unigeniture. But you can only do that if you've got these other norms of coercion in place.
Yeah. Again, sort of overgeneralizing, these tend to be societies where females really do a lot of the work. So the sort of the typical scenario I might have mentioned is that a man clears a plot of land, and then the wife works the land, and she provides for her children, and sometimes she also provides for the husband. In fact, this is what we see in many ethnographies of sub-Saharan Africa. So things are a lot more nuanced than the picture that we're painting here, but that is certainly a very interesting point. And I think also this goes to the heart of the distinction between polygynous marriage versus concubinage. Concubinage is precisely a system where a woman enters into a relationship knowing that her children will not inherit anything. So it would actually be very interesting to study those systems. What are the incentives to these women from entering those relationships? I have one more.
Does your model account for the varying degrees of acceptance in different societies of bastards? I'm thinking of the contrast between the way in which the British peerage is cluttered up with the offspring, the illegitimate offspring of Charles II, compared with the injunction in Deuteronomy that the offspring of an illegitimate union shall not be accepted into the house of the Lord until the 10th generation.
Right, interesting. So the model only speaks to that very indirectly, to the extent that we distinguish between polygynous marriage and polygynous mating. So in our framework, the offspring of polygynous marriage are the legitimate heirs, and then the male may have other offspring, but those do not inherit. I think that is again, there are issues with, how do you distinguish between concubinage and polygynous marriage, but it speaks to that issue only indirectly. But I think I was mentioning this to Dan earlier, to me the value of this very simplistic model in many ways is that it forces us to define these categories very explicitly and very precisely. So I read a lot of history relating to these issues, and the historians haven't figured out that polygynous marriage and concubinage are not the same thing necessarily. So they don't necessarily define the two as separately. So you're trying to read some history, and it's very confusing because you don't know what they're talking about. So the value of this kind of model is that it allows us to define things very precisely in those terms, and may be useful, maybe not, but then we have to refine our definitions. There's a question.
Another ecological variable that purportedly predicts polygyny is disease prevalence.
Mm-hmm.
Bobby Lowe found this
Right.
some years back using the SCCS. Have you considered that at all in your models?
No. Bobby Lowe's work was probably, remind me because I've read that many years ago, she was probably looking at marriage strategy.
She actually measured it as levels of polygyny.
Right, but in relation to marriage strategy.
Yeah, she explained this by saying that, or the reason you find this is that women, it would be more beneficial for them to make the genes versus resources trade-off in areas of high disease.
Yeah, I think that explanation is probably more relevant to explaining mating patterns as opposed to marriage patterns. And of course, the two overlap to some degree, but not necessarily. And so, I think the reason is very valuable. Whether it applies to marriage norms directly as opposed to the mating patterns in different societies, I wouldn't be able to say. But it's not something that we include in here. John?
So I guess my question is might be related to Thorpe's question.
Mm-hmm.
So I may not have understood the model quite, or what all is in the model, but so your model, does it assume that all women in polygynous marriages have the same access to resources? If, say, obviously if they're providing all their own resources, then that's not relevant, but in cases where they're not, does it assume that they do?
No, they don't vary. So each wife gets an equal share, or each of the wives' offspring get an equal share.
But that might also affect the strategy, right? Because if you're the fourth wife, you might end up getting less.
Oh yeah, for sure. Again, variation in the different players, both males and females, is not something we have in here because these models get complicated very quickly. But it's certainly something that might play a role, and it might, for example, something I was talking to Brooke earlier, it might explain why you see ultimogeniture in some societies, where the last-born son inherits as opposed to the first-born son, where you have a more established sort of relationship. So that is certainly something that's of interest here.
And the other question
that I have is about, I guess, relationship between number of wives and number of kids per wife.
Right.
So that, I mean, how does that come into your model? So you've got,
It
you have
doesn't.
one wife, you know,
Yeah.
she has a fixed number,
Yeah.
a certain number of kids who will
Yeah.
then either, the different ways of
Yeah.
inheriting.
So in the model, we just treat it as number of offspring grows linearly with number of wives. So there is no variation in number of wives per children. So yeah, sort of ignore that.
I can see why you do it.
Yeah, but all of these considerations are certainly very relevant, and I think, as I said, this is sort of a baseline that allows us to think about these questions in more systematic ways. But there's a lot that we need to look into. Question.
What happens in societies where there is nothing to inherit? It's like,
Right.
does marriage become maybe superfluous in those societies, or what do you say?
That is very interesting. You picked on something very relevant to this whole debate, that we're talking about societies where there is wealth inheritance. In forager societies, typically there isn't a lot of wealth that is transmitted and is durable enough to be valuable. There might be a house, but the house will only survive for a handful of years, so not as valuable as where you have land in some of these historical European societies. So one way of thinking about marriage in those societies is what Richard Alexander called environmentally imposed monogamy, meaning that you don't have a norm enforcing monogamy, but most men in the society are monogamous. If you're a very skillful hunter and you bring in a lot of resources or something, then you may have polygyny, but polygyny is limited to a very small fraction of males. This relates to a sort of bigger question in anthropology, which is how do you define marriage norms? Some people have argued that we should define them precisely in terms of legitimacy, so who inherits. That's one way of looking at marriage norms. And so where you have this more flexible, fluid arrangements in some societies, that really marriage is more of a sort of mating arrangement. It's unclear. I think this framework is particularly useful for thinking of societies where you have wealth that is.
So I know you spent a lot of time sort of drawing these distinctions between marriage versus bonding versus mating, and I think there's good reasons for that. But on some levels, these things are interrelating. Like inheritance is resources, which is will have a effect on your reproductive and all those things. So just do you have any thoughts, or would you want to care to say anything about sort of that tension between places where sort of your sort of selfish genes sort of inheritance and what sort of outcomes would be driven by those processes, how the tension between those sorts of outcomes versus, like, you could think that there'd be reasons why that might have an influence on societal marriage systems like that, but that tension between those two things, I'd be interested in.
You mean between the mating and marriage?
Well, you could think that, for your pure sort of Darwinian getting your genes to the next generation, that could have an influence on society, what would be societally accepted, but that might not have the same outcome as if you're really just thinking about inheritance of wealth, and there's a tension.
Right. So I guess what you're saying is that, if you're a man, the best strategy for you would be to, I'm not questioning whether you're a man.
Well,
sorry.
No, but
if I were a man, the best strategy would be to, in some ecological conditions, would be to marry monogamously and mate polygenously, right? If I were to sort of maximizing the kind of sort of gene copies that I'm transmitting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's the only example. I think, if for a female who, if you're like a fourth wife or whatever, that none of your kids are going to get any inheritance, you still have an interest in getting your genes out as much as you want.
Right.
And so,
Yeah, I guess the assumption that underlies this is that in these societies, the sort of getting your genes out there is much more efficiently done through wealth than not. But that is certainly relevant in this framework. In the model, we allow males and females to have extramarital mating, but we don't include that in the in computing the implicit fitness of the different players. So we're kind of assuming that the effect of wealth is much larger compared
Yeah, it's washed.
yeah. Yes.
I was just going to say, it seems to me that Bobby Lowe result fits with your law, actually. Well, because you have that parameter in there that measures the benefit of, so why women would choose to mate with somebody other than their husband? It's a good genes benefit. So if you assume the cost of mate guarding was constant, then random or something, and as you increase the benefit of getting good genes, you should see a bigger motive to it should be harder to guard your wife, and therefore you should see more polygyny.
Right, yeah, yeah. So that, the sort of mate guarding is certainly a potential mechanism that might explain the sort of what I call the social cost of polygyny. Simply if you have multiple wives, it's harder to mate guard them. And in fact, this is, Bobby Lowe talks about this, but also Austin Hughes had talked about this many years ago. So yeah, I just hadn't thought about that work in relation to this, but I should definitely look into it. Yes.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. And I was wondering, in looking at the historical reconstruction, if everyone in, let's say in the Indo-European case, if you go back to ancient Greece or Rome or something like that, was everyone allowed to marry? I mean, in other words, if you were a slave,
Right.
it did, and so when we have the evidence of, I was wondering about marriage itself and the discussion that you just had like about a minute ago.
Sure.
You know, and who could marry and who couldn't marry, and what's going on in those cases, or in the United States, you know, pre-Civil War type of thing. I mean, I actually don't even know. I mean, could slaves marry in the United States? I mean, I was just wondering about that, and if that makes any difference in your discussion here, does it strengthen it even more if we could have evidence of this?
So the way I think about it, I don't know the United States case, but I've read a little bit about the Roman case, and again, this is obviously filtered through what historians tell me. My understanding is that marriage, a formal marriage, really only applied to rich people, to wealthy people. Soldiers didn't marry, so there were unions. You know, people got together, and in fact, I believe initially, you know, marriage was a informal arrangement between two people to the extent that, you know, I could claim, oh, this guy here, you know, yeah, he said that, and then this created a lot of problems because we were into this sort of he said, she said situation. So very slowly they started formalizing that, where you know, it's a good idea to have a witness to the arrangement. So initially it was very sort of tenuous arrangement, but it then became formalized for the wealthier people. For some categories, like soldiers, marriage wasn't even a concept at the time. As I said, the United States case, I wouldn't know the evidence relating to that.
So marriage itself would be skewed towards property for you.
So I think within this framework, you know, marriage is really linked to the transfer of resources, and so resources are owned by some people. So that's what you'd see.
I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm very proud because almost all my questions were asked, except two.
Okay.
So one is, did you consider successive monogamy? Because, and then you have this problem of which child inherits.
So this relates to the question that came up at the very beginning of the serial monogamy or serial polygyny, polyandry. Different people call it different things. So we don't look at that specifically in the model, just to keep to keep it tractable. So we don't. My understanding, and again I wish historians would tell me more about this, is that divorce, where it was allowed until very recently, was at very low rates.
Yeah, but you have death.
Yeah, that's
I
true
mean,
actually. Yeah.
pregnancy didn't work out. I mean, the percentage of
Yeah.
success.
That is true. I think in those cases what would be interesting to look at, and it's not something that I have done or know of, other people have done this, would be to see when you do have death, where do the children go essentially? Does the father take care of the children? Do they go back to the mother's family or what a kin group? In some societies that I can think of, they actually go with the mother's kin group.
But it's not just that, it's the fact that then when you have a second wife, you have a second set of children.
Right.
And so your whole laws of
Yeah.
marriage could be
So again,
different.
you know, if the children of the first wife, if the first wife dies, go back to her
they're
family,
done.
then they're, and this varies across societies. You know, in some societies the children belong to the patrimony, they belong to the father's family. In some societies that I can think of where men provide a bride wealth to the wife's family. If the wife dies, they can either return the bride wealth or they have to provide another woman to substitute the deceased wife. So, yeah, different societies have different arrangements.
And my second question might be like a third question to me about, because I'm a linguist.
Okay.
And I only work on data.
Uh-huh.
And so once you've built your model, how do you test it? Because you've been talking about historians a lot, but what are your sources? Texts, narratives?
So, with regards to the historical literature, you know, I'm not trained as a historian myself, so I have to rely on what the historians tell me.
But what is the motivation to build your model, and how do you test it?
The motivation is.
I'm sorry, it's
No,
coming
no,
from a
it's
different
a
field. It's
question.
interesting to see.
Yeah, so the motivation to me is there's, in fact, my personal frustration has been with the fact that if you look at the historical data, as I said, there isn't a very precise definition. And so there are certain scholars who will talk about concubinage and as concubinage, so where the first wife's children, so the first wife essentially has special status compared to the other women, and others call this polygyny. And so I think the motivation behind doing this kind of modeling, which as I said is very simplistic, is that it allows you to think explicitly about how you want to define these things. And then you derive some predictions, which are very broad in this particular case. But they do fit with what we know about the anthropology of these questions, and so then we can go out to the field, for example, and try and ask some questions. You know, how is inheritance divided up in polygynous societies as opposed to monogamous societies? And if we had the very detailed historical data on this, which we don't very often have, can we look at shifts in these norms over time? That would be especially interesting.
So going back to your teeter-totter model of the balancing
Right.
pressures of the male strategy and the female strategy, it strikes me that another, and this would be historical data, probably not there in most of the ethnographic literature, certainly not in the archaeological, but possibly in the historic. Another avenue to explore the model would be to look at commitment and enforcement mechanisms, right? So the one case that I'm familiar with that speaks, well, it doesn't speak to, but is entirely consistent with your teeter-totter model, is the development of diamond engagement rings in the United States in the 1920s, which occurred when breach of promise to marry laws were repealed. So prior to that, women could sue a man if he had promised to marry. They had engaged in premarital sex, as was common, and then he reneged on that promise because she was now essentially, her mate value had been decreased, and she potentially faced the burden of paternity without investment. Right? And the solution, those laws were abolished for a variety of reasons, but the solution then presented itself in terms of a commitment device whereby the man could present, a third of his or a quarter of his income and say, and I'm objectively committed now by virtue of the fact that I can't afford the same investment elsewhere, right? And so you expect each party, given the teeter-totter, right, that they have a strategic advantage in exploiting greater direction in one pressure relative to the other. and therefore they have to come up with a mechanism whereby they convince each other that they're going to arrive at the balance point. So that,
Yeah.
conceivably that's there in some of the historical material.
Yeah.
I mean, ethnographically, we just get these, broad stroke pictures that this is the norm, right?
Yeah,
And that doesn't tell you
indeed.
anything. But what comes, essentially what I'm directing your attention to is what comes before the actual marriage.
Yeah.
Since you talked about divorce, but
That is
something
very
has to happen first.
Yeah, it's not something that I thought about, but it's certainly a very interesting case. And the sort of in the other societies we might think of transfers of wealth at marriage, right? That have may have a similar function. So yeah, that would be actually very
Right, and you might envision some kind of good faith down payment as being a common practice, right?
Yeah.
I know that it is in the one place that I feel.
That's interesting. I mean, obviously, in many societies in Europe, historically, we'd find substantial dowries. So quite in the opposite direction, actually, compared to the sort of male commitment that you were describing. So, yeah, that's a very interesting idea. Thanks. Yes.
Do you mind going back to that slide where you had the linguistic phylogeny?
Mm-hmm.
That one right there. And so you have this interesting outlier in the Albanian,
Right.
with the polygyny. And my understanding of the Albanian language area is that it's not only small, but kind of the soil is kind of rough.
Mm-hmm.
And your model mentions land
Right.
as a predictor of this. I mean, I can see. I don't know whether. I think if you go one more step, you have the
Right,
points
yeah,
in the.
reconstructions, yeah.
Could you go?
Oh, this one or the.
Yeah. So it appears to me that the Albanian group possibly would have been practicing monogamy before
Mm-hmm.
going back, and you seem to have them going back to polygyny.
Right.
And you have a parallel of that with like the Latter-day Saint movement in the United States.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, I mean, I can see the land thing working in the Latter-day Saint movement, but I'm having a hard time seeing it in the Albanian side. Can you think of any other factors? Is it?
Yes. So the Albanian case in this particular community in the Standard Cross-Cultural Sample is an Islamic community. Now, this brings to me, in my mind at least, and this is something I really wish I had the data to test and I don't, the idea of do different religious norms get acquired more easily where the ecological conditions allow them to. And I wish I had the data to do that. My sort of pet anecdote, and I would caveat that multiple anecdotes are not data, but let me tell you this, that the interesting case relating religion to marriage norms have to do with sub-Saharan Africa. We know there have been missionary efforts in sub-Saharan Africa trying to enforce monogamy for 5 or 6 centuries. And we have accounts of missionaries writing back saying, I can get these people to not to meet on a Friday, I can get them to come to church on a Sunday, I can get them to do all these things, but when it comes to polygyny, I cannot get them to give up polygyny. It's so sort of culturally entrenched. Polygyny gives you status, presumably some people think because it provides labor, and so the wealthy men are the ones who have multiple wives and multiple children, and it goes in both directions. And in many communities, again, anecdotally, what we do see is that missionaries allowed informal polygyny because otherwise these people would switch to Islam. And so in this particular case, we have a particular social system, so a very strong norm for polygynous marriage that is driving which religious variant, if you like, is being acquired. And I wish I had the data to look at the spread of the beliefs and the changes in marriage norms, but I don't. So I think that's how much I'm willing to say with regards to a relationship between marriage religious beliefs, but it's certainly an interesting point. The sort of case, I mean, thanks for pointing this out actually, I never thought about this. I thought about the Mormon case as a interesting sample of one to look at transitions from monogamy to polygyny in relation to land availability, but I hadn't thought about this case study, so I'll look into this in more detail.
Okay, well, that's kind of long.
Thank you.